Alright, as I said, deciding whether a child or a relative is a qualifying person is really hard. So in this video, I'm going to do that step by step. So it's kind of like decision tree, okay? It's not hard, but you have to follow a certain route. And what I call this kind of scenario as a route dependent. So you have to be qualified for this, and then this, and then this. So it's a logical flow going on, and let's get started. So first, for a kid, right? If you're dealing with the kids, such as, for example, a son, daughter, grandchildren, right? This kid needs to live with the taxpayer for more than half of the year, right? So first is more than half of the year. So more than half of the year, I'm going to do half of the year, okay? More than half of the year. Oops, let me just write this way. More than half of the year, and have to meet certain criteria, okay? So if you look at kids, well, the first thing you need to check is whether this kid lived with taxpayer more than half the year. Okay, so once that's qualified, we can go to the next step. So that's the route dependent. So this fails, you don't need to look at all these following steps, but it's qualified, go to next step, right? So there comes to a lot of scenario, because even though it's a qualifying child, it's not necessarily kid. So, you know what? I am going to get rid of the kid here, because the children does not necessarily mean it's a kid. So, first, this can be child, but old enough to marry. Okay? So, this is the first, transition of the concept that you need to change. The children does not necessarily mean the kid. Okay? So I just get a little bit tricky gotcha there, right? So first, the child can be single. Okay? So if the children is single, then you know what? It's just to qualify. So I'm going to say qualified person. Okay? I'm going to use QP for there. If this child lived with taxpayer for more than half a year, right? And not necessarily as a kid, if it's single, just automatically become qualified person. Okay? And this automatic become a qualified person does not necessarily mean that the taxpayer can claim this person as a dependent. Okay? Doesn't really matter. They can claim dependent or does not claim dependent, doesn't really matter, as long as that child is single. That's a qualified person because they live together for more than half of a year. Okay, this is the scenario one. But remember, it can be a grow up. The child can be grow up. Some daughters maybe they're already pretty old enough to get married. So, if he or she is married, okay, and look at that. If he or she is married, then you can't just automatically to give that as a qualified person. So, remember, this does not, the first scenario, single scenario, does not have the requirement of the taxpayer can claim the person as dependent, but this scenario you have to be able to claim as dependent. Okay? If it's married, the taxpayer can be able to claim him or her as a dependent, then you will go to the qualified person. Okay? But if it's married, but the taxpayer cannot claim as a dependent, you know what? Is not a qualified person. Okay? So, basically, if it's single, automatic qualified person, married, have stricter rules, have to be able to claim it as a dependent, then qualified person. If it's married and cannot claim as dependent, not a qualified person. So that's the first child scenario, okay? Remember, I just trick you a little bit. Child does not necessarily mean kid, okay? So if it's grandchild, maybe can be a kid, but you know what? For sons and daughters, they can be old enough to get married, and then they got like a single or married scenario. Right. So this is scenario 1. What about scenario 2? What about it's just relative? Okay? Relative. So, the relative, the relative do have different scenario, because the relative can be the taxpayers like mother and father. I use mother and father because it's just one very close relationship than other relative. Okay? So I'm going to single out mother and father. Relative, if it's taxpayers father or mother. Scenario, and also the other relatives. Okay? So, remember all the qualitative, the relative we're talking about is the qualifying relative. Okay? So, one scenario of the relative is the father and mother. The other is other than the taxpayers, well, father and mother. So, for example, say grandparents, or maybe brothers and sisters who meet a certain test. Okay? So, I'm going to just say others. Okay? So, let's look at scenario 2, father and mother. Taxpayers, father and mother. Okay? So, first scenario. So, if the taxpayer can claim him or her as dependent, still, look at that, it's a dependent test. Okay? If you claim her or he as a dependent, you know what? Qualified person, because you know what, claim as a dependent, and it's the father and mother. Come on, for example, it's like really in elderly father and mother, and they got like no source of income, and you support them. You know what? Sometimes remember, I'm like using a really rough decision tree here because there are certain tasks. Okay, but as long as you fulfill that certain task and got like a dependent, then that's taxpayer's father or mother is a qualified person. Okay? But another scenario is, unfortunately, you cannot claim the taxpayer's father or mother as a dependent. You know what? That scenario is not qualified person. Okay? And for the relative, it's even more complex. Okay? Because it's not just about father and mother, it can be a lot of relative. So the test is more rigorous. Okay? So first, for relatives other than father and mother, he or she lived with the taxpayer for more than half a year. Okay? So still more than half a year test. Let me just look at here. More than half a year test. Okay? And he or she is related to the taxpayer in one of the ways listed on the immediate relationship. Okay? There is a like specific rule here. So first you have to like fulfill this criteria, and I also work as a programmer, so you know what? You have to fulfill this and this scenario in order to make it work. Okay? So you have to be immediate relationship. Okay? Immediate relationship. Lived more than half a year and related taxpayer under the immediate relationship rule. Okay, IRS got a rule, got a subunit, so you can check it out. So these two have to fulfill both. Then, come on, it's a rigorous, right? Qualified person. Okay, last scenario 1. Okay, and what about is like he or she does not live for more than half of the years? Okay, you know what? Not a qualified person. Okay, what about he or she is not related to the taxpayer in one of the ways listed on the immediate relationship? Okay, so this is just immediate relationship. Immediate relationship. Not immediate relationship. You know what? Not qualified person. Okay? As you may wondering, you know, if it's not immediate relationship, and why is still relative? Okay? Because he or she lived with the taxpayer all years as a member of the taxpayer's household, but it's not immediate relationship. So it's a little fine print difference here. So the key point is immediate relationship. Okay? Even though, you know, because he or she lived with the taxpayer all year as a member of the taxpayer household, but it's not immediate relationship, that's still, you know what, not a qualified person. Okay? And, of course, we got 4 is the dependent test. Okay? Dependent test. So if the taxpayers cannot claim these relatives other than father and mother as a dependent, you know what? This rule is strict. So if you can't claim dependent, you cannot classify that relative as a qualified person. Okay? So if you look at this decision tree, you can see only way of recognized as the qualified person is whether it's children live for more than half a years, and single directly, married claim dependent directly. So if it's like truly needs the taxpayer, it's more easily to get the qualified person status. If it's not, you have to add some restriction. For example, you have to marry, you know what, you got someone who can support, right, each other, so you have to claim the dependent and then qualified person, right? For relatives, father and mother, right, have to claim dependent, qualified, right? You can't claim, it's not, because they're like living together and they can like support each other. If they're not dependent on you, it's not qualified person. Right? For the relatives, for other relatives, is even more strict rule. Okay? So the general only rule of thumb is that if it's not truly dependent on you, you got stricter and stricter rules in order to, you know, like hammer out all the scenario that's not qualified. Right? Half of years, immediate relationship, you know what, really strict rule, qualified person. Less than half the years, that means that you just like come to visit, right? So, not qualified. Immediate relationship, if it's not qualified, not qualified. If you cannot like claim dependent, not qualified. Okay, so that's the whole process.